In my historical research into this book by Sha'ul, the Apostle Paul, I've discovered that much of the social fabric of the first century Judaisms that we read about suffered from a sickness that I like to call Ethnocentric Jewish Exclusivism. And I've written about this concept in another paper that dealt with studies on group prejudice, a study that I wrote when I was getting my bachelor's degree in psychology. And I believe the paper that I wrote then nicely summarizes our study on Galatians and helps to form the necessary social background required to properly understand the book in its original historical and religious context, and therefore have decided to include a quote from that work here. So this is from my school paper that I wrote here. I pulled a quote into my own Galatians commentary. It reads, quote, "The New Testament writer Paul of Tarsus, a.k.a. Apostle Paul, had much to say about the Judaisms of his day and the ethnocentric cultural requirements they were imposing on the non-Jews. To be sure, Paul is traditionally misunderstood by the Christianities of today as teaching an abrogation to Torah, circumcision, and Jewish culture as a whole. In a word, ethnic genocide. A proper understanding of Second Temple Judaism will uncover many of the true motives driving the ethnic competition between Jews and non-Jews. Group-level stereotyping of Gentiles by Jews as pejorative pagans with no viable and positive contribution possible for the Jewish community can clearly be seen in this research. Negative attitudes by the Jewish community turned into prejudice against non-Jews, which led to discrimination against non-Jews as an ethnicity and eventually provided the Jewish leaders with a mechanism for installing anti-Gentile group policies that were racially driven. Indeed, the power to enforce group prejudice and discrimination is what gives racism its social advantage over subjugated minorities." End quote. And that's lifted from my Towards Understanding First Century and 21st Century Jewish Attitudes, Studies in Group Prejudice that I put together a few years back. So, what am I really trying to convey here is that I don't want to make it sound like the Jewish people were stone-cold prejudices against racists against the Gentiles. But when we study at least from a sociological perspective and a psychological perspective, if we study the phenomenon of the first century and see the social interaction between these two groups, the people groups, the Jews and the Gentiles, at least the religious Jews, then we can't help but notice similarities between modern-day prejudices and racism when we use that particular lens. And so it's not improper to imagine that type of scenario where first century religious Jews were essentially not even allowing non-Jews a chance to enter into covenant membership with Israel unless they changed their ethnicity first. And that type of language, that type of forced ethnic change is it's unfortunate from the Gentiles' perspective, at least to the perspective of trying to maintain a Gentile heritage. Because if you were a Gentile and living in Paul's day, you didn't have really much of a choice if you wanted to gain membership into Israel and be recognized on a legal basis. So it's within that social worldview, I think, that we're going to gain an appreciation for understanding what Paul's trying to teach in the book of Galatians, because that forms the background historically for the book of Galatians itself. Let's keep reading my commentary, and you're going to see this played out.